This has been a show that's been about 4 years in the making, and I'm really pleased to introduce Feltus and Lani Irwin, who are really wonderful painters. There is a flyer that talks about how I met them, but I'll do it very briefly. Alan was an old, almost grad school art hero, and I went to Forum Gallery, got catalogs, and that was the end of it, of course. But you know, until maybe about 15 or so years later, I was given his email, and I contacted him. He was really great about answering it, and simultaneously, a friend of mine was in my studio and said, "You must get to know Lani Irwin's work because there's a lot of similarities." And I did. And of course, did not realize that they were married. And liked both of their works. And then eventually I realized they did, and I said, I've got to curate that. Because it is a really interesting thing to curate a married couple. So here they are, both very accomplished artists. The Rome Prize, both in the Smithsonian, both in the Hirshhorn. You can see Alan's work at the Forum in New York, Forum Gallery, and this is where I'm going to have trouble.
No, just
this is on view. Yikes. This is on view. The show is from today to the 25th, and it's open Monday through Friday, because it is for students, from 12 to 8, which gives you a chance to come in early and many times. And you know that we're having the talk right now.
I'm starting with Rousseau's Sleeping Gypsy, because that's, thinking back on my childhood, I loved this painting since I was a little boy, you know, maybe 6 years old, 7 years old or something, seeing it in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Okay, change, please. Okay, I'll jump and I'll jump back and forth a little. These are not mine. These are, if you can read, de Kooning, Gorky, and John Graham. John Graham is a little less known than Gorky and de Kooning, but they were good friends and they influenced each other, as you can see even in this early period of their work. In graduate school at Yale, I gave myself the assignment of making painting a Gorky that Gorky never painted, which I think you'll see, and the photograph that it's taken from. Gorky made a beautiful painting, 2 versions actually. One in the Whitney Museum in New York was the one I had access to from Yale. I'd come back to New York and I'd see it. When I was painting my version of Gorky with a different source photo, I would look at that Gorky in the Whitney Museum, and I went back, at one point the first time I saw the painting after starting it, and I changed the color because I was off. You know, I could see he was much more pearly, silvery or something than I was. Okay, let's change. So that's I can see him from here more easily without turning. Yeah, that's the photograph of Gorky with his mother. His mother, he was Armenian, his mother died in the genocide, starvations or genocide in Armenia. Gorky moved to New York, or to the United States, ended up in New York. That's the painting I was mentioning on the right, that is taken from the photo. So it's Gorky as a boy with his mother. And I was very interested in how shapes are made more interesting, you know, kind of drawing that had the curves like you see in the shoulder and the arms of both figures. and the flattening of space and form. So, for example, her dress, it was one of those multi-pattern things, as you see in the photograph. And it ended up just this simple shape, but very beautiful shape. So that's, okay, thanks. And this is my painting on the right that I did at Yale, based on the Gorky paintings, and this photograph of André Breton and Gorky himself with his daughter when she was a little girl on his shoulders. Okay. Then at Yale, I did a few paintings I'll show you more quickly that I wanted this influence to be to dissipate on its own. I didn't want to suddenly start something new. 2 years after graduate school, I went off to Rome, Italy, as I had won the Rome Prize Fellowship, also referred to as the Prix de Rome. But Prix de Rome, the French words, refer to the French Academy more or less because that started centuries before. You know, people like, I can think maybe David and some of those people had a French Academy in Rome fellowship. But the American Academy in Rome is what I had. And I had it for 2 years, which was sometimes given for 2 years. 2 painters at a time, 2 sculptors, and some architects and scholars, art historians, classicists, and that sort of thing. A small community. And we'd have meals together in separate studios. But this painting, when I saw this painting we'll move more quickly after I get through this part, but I saw this painting by Felice Casorati, C-A-S-O-R-A-T-I, one of the Italians painting between the wars, between World War I and World War II, primarily. That was a very rich period of Italian painting in Rome and in the north of Italy, where Casorati was from. Important figurative painting happening between the wars. And this painting, I didn't know Casorati first. He was not known in this country. You couldn't, long before the ability to look people up on the computer, there were no books that I knew of about his work. But I was very interested that my memoir, which you've probably seen notices for, it's available, you can order it. But the memoir talks about this and the importance of this in my work. I looked at this, a painting about that size, maybe more or less the size you're seeing it. And it just stopped me. I looked at it, it had everything. I thought, this has everything I want a painting to have. It has 2 figures, one is nude, one is clothed, with no explanation why that is. Why is one clothed? Are they a couple? Is she a model waiting between poses or what? You know, it's just not clear. Except for the red slippers. That would have been before men would have a red shoe, I think. In those days they didn't. So a red slipper indicated a domestic, intimate scene. And it may have been red just because as he was painting he thought red looked good there. Newspapers on the floor, 2 chairs, a little bit of architecture, doorway, 3 chairs actually. I thought that's enough. I can stay with that until I have reason not to. And I decided at that point at the Academy to stay with female figures until I had a reason not to stay with female figures. So I break out of that quite a bit later. I painted a lot of paintings that are all made up. Okay, change. I was also doing collages. The one on top is about this big, like that, maybe 10 or 12 inches across, I can't remember. And I took that collage with me to Rome, to the academy, to get me started, to give me something to start painting about. The way I had with the Gorky going to Yale, I didn't want to lose weeks or months floundering, not knowing what can I do in this incredible place. Beautiful studio and incredible city, Rome. So the others are, these are all collages I made in Rome. There's a bunch of them, a few of them that I still have. I never showed these to sell or anything. They're from my, did I say Rome? They're from Yale, from my graduate school, and the year after I did some. But I took that one, the top one, to Rome with me. And you'll see it goes through, it went through a lot of changes. First, those half-dancer figures in the middle came out, then the table, I think, on the left, finally the figure on the right. The only thing that remained in the painting that you'll see next, I think, is the horizontal line between floor and wall. You'll see it. My paintings go through, a lot of them, most of them go through a lot of changes because I'm working without a source, without a still life or a model posing or a photograph or anything. Okay. Yeah, that's it. That's what came out of that. And that's big. That's about 6 feet across, I think. Yeah, it says 69 by 95 inches across. It's big. I thought, work big, I have a year. I thought I had a year, and it ended up being 2 years to paint there, and I wanted kind of no limitations, including size. Somehow I'd get them home rolled up, as I did. The figure in the middle, I thought about her. I didn't want my figures to have the elegance, the contrapposto of Roman and Greek sculpture, where the hips are like that, and there's a lot of movement in the figure. I thought I'll plant her on 2 feet, kind of heavy, and she somehow became almost like a weightless figure, in spite of being a little on the heavy side as a person. If she were a person, she feels like she's almost floating. I was interested in the blue shadows and the yellow of paintings I had seen, like French landscapes and things. If it's the time of day when the shadows are from the hot sun, the light and the shadows would seem, in contrast, to be very cool. There's that difference of shadow and light and warm and cool. One thing you'll see, we find ourselves partly as a painter, though some of you are students here, painting students, some maybe painters. We find ourselves, our tendencies, what comes from within, like what we don't want to do is as important as what we choose to do. When we look at paintings in books and museums, what we're not interested in tells us something about ourselves. What we are interested in, or what we can't help doing, like in my case, there's a quiet, a silence in the paintings. There's not movement, there's stillness. Figures aren't, on one foot, leaning like they're about to jump or fall over. Some painters do that exclusively. I don't want that. If I have that by chance because I'm changing a figure, it gets out of there. Okay. And the drapery is almost always made up in the same sense that the figures are made up. I'll use mirrors for sources, but in a painting like this, where a mirror wouldn't give me more than maybe the head of the figure on the right, profile is hard to do with mirrors. I've done it with 2 mirrors. Sometimes I'll do it, but I'm not so happy with the difficulties involved. But the female torso, from the period in Rome at the Academy, I was interested in Roman and Greek sculpture. Rome had a lot of copies of Greek sculpture, ancient Rome. Other than killing people in colosseums, they were great architects and they were great sculptors. And in some places great painters, like the Pompeians. It's not really Roman, but within Italy. This one is called Mother Self, which is the title of my memoir. That title is the title of the painting. It's that title because as I was painting her, and it's a medium-sized painting, my figures are, as most of us who paint make a single figure on a canvas or part of a figure, we're usually working a little under life size. If you were to measure it, it's a little less, which gives you a little space, not quite in it, like coming out at us. I was working with a mirror on that head, and I thought, well, that's got a lot of me in it, as they always do because I use mirrors. But they're me idealized or simplified or made younger, certainly, than what's happened in the last decades. But this was, as I was doing that, I thought, well, it's sort of me. Why don't I call it Mother Self? Usually I give a title after a painting is finished, and it's often a kind of almost random thing. I don't usually have a good reason for a title. But in this case, Mother Self made sense. And then I put, there are 2 postcards at the top. One is one of those Roman copies of a Greek marble Venus, and the other is a Carrà, Carlo Carrà, Italian between the war, that period or early period, behind the painting, so you don't see the whole thing, but it's a painting that it might be titled Mother and Child or something. It's very similar. It was himself or a child in a boy's those little sailor suits that boys were sometimes dressed in for fancy occasions. I named it Mother Self. The writing in my paintings is, with one exception, illegible, like on an envelope or something. They don't read. If you come up close, you can't read anything because it's just the nature of writing. Okay. Now, so that was the beginning. I decided I'll stay with the mother and son theme, do a little series, see where it goes. As my memoir says quite clearly, I had a difficult childhood in terms of relationship to my mother. Not always, but, and not when I was really young. But it became difficult. And so in the second of the mother and son paintings, I chose to make, I didn't want the boy to look like me. I was a skinny little guy with a different face from what you see. But the wrinkled shirt, to me it was kind of anxiety, like I was doing this. So symbolically it was kind of showing that, plus the hands were kind of like anxiety, a little bit of a furrow here maybe. And the mother who was ignoring me, absorbed in her I Ching book, if any of you know I Ching. Anyway, absorbed in herself, ignoring me. In the early years we more or less lived together, but early on it was more a matter of not enough love, a kind of neglect. And then it became difficulty between us communicating and agreeing on anything, and she became critical and so on, but that's in the book. Okay, this has progressions from beginning day through, going left to right and dropping down left to right and so on, and then the finished painting on the right. To show you, if you look at some of the things, like in the second one on top, the middle one on top, 2 figures. Then a third figure comes between them. She stays for a while, she turns more. In the middle of the bottom, she's in a different position, and there's a tree, and then she's out of there altogether. Clothing will come in, they'll be clothed or not clothed as I'm working. And it's all by kind of intuition, sometimes a very small feeling like maybe I should do this or maybe I should do that. So I'll try it on the painting. You know, this is pre-Photoshop, which I've never done. But before you had the possibility, unless you cut paper, and some people would cut a shape in paper and attach it either with the wet paint or a piece of tape to see what it would look like, I just repaint and move things and change them. Now in this case, I made a second version of the finished painting on the left. So the one on the right is another version going back to the 3 figures and making, moving who's nude, who's not. And that came about because my older son saw me do this slide lecture before I had done the second one, and said afterwards on our way home, why don't you do another version of that with the 2 women in the chair? So I thought, okay, I'll do it. Okay. That's it. Okay. And I've possibly gone over my time. So I give this to Lani, my wife, for many years. We've been together, 52 years, 50 years? Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay.
I decided to start with my last finished painting, so you know who I am and where I go from the beginning, because mine is a little different. And I'll just say briefly about this painting. I had this sense. My paintings have a lot of mix. I paint figures. I don't have figures in the room, but I have objects in the room. So my paintings are generally a combination of objects and figures. Objects I paint from observation, figures I make up. And I have boxes of what I call body parts. So if I need hands, I'll put 5 hands out there. If I need, heads, I've got 5 heads, and I use paintings. So in this one, I wanted, unlike most of my others, I wanted not to have toys and objects that are made by man. All of the things in this one I wanted to be actually natural, because I'm a little worried about our world that we're living in right now. Okay, change. So when I finished, one other thing I should say is that when I was finishing graduate school, he came to teach. He came to teach at AU. He was teaching undergraduates, and I was a graduate student, almost finished. But when he invited graduate students over to see the paintings when they arrived from Rome. And it was a pretty astounding and amazing experience to see those early Rome paintings, all those big things that he showed you in the beginning. I'd never seen anything like that in any gallery, in any magazine, anywhere, because they combined classic, beautiful figurative painting, but they were modern. They were not, they were not derivative in any way. So I was very excited. I finished in our day in graduate school. In my school, we did not have separate studios. We all worked in one group studio, so there might have been 25 of us in there. We didn't have much freedom. It was still more or less a continuation of what undergraduate was like in those days. So, finished graduate school, finished classwork. Now I've got to teach myself to paint. I have to figure out what I like, because there's nobody in there talking to me. So we went to Provincetown, and I found a seagull skull. It's really strange to see these paintings blown up to this scale, because this painting is about this big. So at that time, I was really interested in making form with the brush stroke. And I painted skulls always from observation, okay. Then they moved on to be toys and objects, and these are polychrome mannequins that we have in the studio. So they changed, they began to evolve, okay. I love Paolo Uccello. I love the complexity of curves and objects and space that are all just moving around and integrating and changing. So this was one of my sources to look at. My paintings aren't like that, but that's one of the things I look at, okay. Gradually, they're kind of developing, but I'm still always working from observation in this period. You know, I had not broken away from that. Okay. At this point, I started to break away, so that the pattern on the floor came out of a Carpaccio painting, and the ball up there was sort of in the sky, and the drape wasn't in the room. Okay.
Oops.
Oop.
That's good.
Well, no, go back to the Simone Martini. This is another one of my source materials. We went together to Italy in 1974, and I went for the first time to Assisi. And these frescoes by Simone Martini were life-changing for me. I just fell in love with them. Again, you know, the integration of space, but in this one, the hands. I realized that gesture of hand was extremely important to me. And so this is something that moves on through my work, okay? This painting actually lives close to you all. This painting lives in Little Compton, Rhode Island. It was my largest painting to date, and I was beginning to take liberties with everything. Paint clothing that didn't exist, change the colors of the mannequins, put hands on the mannequins that didn't have hands on them. And I began to realize I was painting figure by implication at this point. And you'll see all the way through my work are certain elements that keep repeating, like cards and hands and patterns. I love patterns. Okay. This is another painting that is important to me, and it has something, you know, to do with these hands and the mysterious ambiguity of the relationship of the figures. You know, we just don't know what's going on. You know, they're sort of in the same space, but are they really? I don't know. This is a Lippi that's in the Metropolitan. Okay. So this kind of sense of, in a way, using similar compositional elements to the early Renaissance paintings that I love in Italy sort of continues through my work. But I'm adding things and moving things and not necessarily sticking to the still life anymore. This is a diptych. I wanted to try to paint something really large. Now the color of the two slides is off, because in the two of them they would have run together and not look like they were so separate. But I don't have this one anymore, so I can't rephotograph it. It's called Carnival, which is another theme that I repeat. I don't know exactly what it is, but I love carnival things and targets and toys that don't have any sense of why they're together. Come on. In 1977, we were going back to Italy, and we were going to travel with two friends, and we were going to do a carnival to earn money. You know, and so Alan and I both painted canvas that were going to be backdrops, and Alan was going to be a magician, and I was going to dance with the dancer girl, and the guy was the musician. And so we were making these things, and this was going to be a circus backdrop. And they ended up not being able to go. We went, came back, finished the paintings as paintings, but that's why it started out in this way. And it's very related to in a lot of ways, to the Baltus street scene that I like very much. But again, not, because of course it isn't really like that, and it's very much like a playhouse. But most of that's all made up except for the, the few objects that are there. Okay? And in this one, I don't think I put the original painting in. One of the other things about me, I also work, as Alan does, where things change and they evolve and they change and I move things and take things. But what I do that he doesn't do is years later, I decide, I want to move that. And any of you who paint know that that doesn't work very well. You move one thing and then everything moves. So this painting completely changed from the original. The only thing that's left is the truck and the doll in the truck bed. So anyway, okay. At this point, this is one of those paintings of mannequins that was years earlier, had been shown, had been this, that, and went back onto the easel, and one of them became a figure. So at this point, I decided that I was going to stop painting figure by implication and start painting figure. So from this point on, I paint figure in combination with objects. And for a while, the mannequins kind of stayed in there with the figures. Okay. Mm-hmm. But I continued to paint still lifes. And as I said, it's a lot of, like if you look at the size, this is much bigger than the painting. The Pinocchio Alan made for our youngest son. Joseph was in love with Pinocchio for his whole life, and so Alan found a tree outside that had some interesting shape that looked like it could turn into a torso, and Pinocchio even got his foot in the paint. Naughty boy. Okay. And I paint self-portraits through these, not as frequently as he does, and definitely not as I've in recent years. Can't quite look at myself in the mirror anymore. And for a while, I liked writing on the paintings, the title and everything. But, okay. Now this is a case where this painting I painted, and I find that, as anyone who paints finds, that every decision you make regulates the next decision. So, but all along the way I wonder, well, what would happen if I did that? So in this case, I decided, after a period of time of finishing this one, to make a second one based on the same relationship of the two figures and see what happened if I made different decisions. Okay. With this one, I was trying to make a still life again, but I have found as the years have gone on that even if I start a painting as a still life, figure comes in there at some point, uninvited. Literally, sometimes I don't want it to come in, but it just does. Okay. My figures have gotten to the point where they are either life-size and sometimes slightly larger than life-size now. And it means that for the most part, I no longer am able to paint the full figure because it doesn't fit. So, and gesture of hands is extremely important to me. Often that's what the painting starts with. In the cases of all three of these, it was the hand gestures that started the whole painting. And then at some point, the objects on the table come in. Okay. And I've always liked the card player paintings, card players by all the various people throughout history. From, I love the de la Tour card playing and Cézanne, all of them. Okay. Now this one started because I was feeling, it was a period when I was feeling restrained about being able to say what I was feeling. And the painting, so all of this kind of tied up stuff was about myself feeling unable to iterate whatever was going on within myself. This is just a little story about what happens sometimes when somebody writes about your paintings. So this painting then went to New York to a show. And there was a new gallery guide at that time, and the man actually featured this painting, you know, one page, and I thought, this is really great, you know, we all want to. But he wrote underneath it, this painting is about bondage and sexual asphyxiation. I actually didn't know what either of those things meant. I had to ask my son. But what happened as a result of that is that as soon as the show was over, my gallery dealer would not show that painting anymore. She put it in the closet and then sent it home. So I went back to Italy, and I decided, all right, I'm really feeling pissed off. So I painted that one, same size canvas, basically same figure, but she's got more clothing on than she could, you know, she could drown in the clothing. Okay. This painting all started basically from this gesture that I liked. My main struggle with it was because the canvas was too small. Never do that. Okay. So this painting came after that on a bigger canvas, but of course it became a completely different sense, you know, of the vulnerability of the other one, and this one becomes a circus girl. Self-portrait as a young acrobat. And when we for this show, when we were titling the paintings, Alan talked about a little bit about titling. We had our sons were with us, and we sat at the table with a nice bottle of red wine and named paintings, and my paintings for this show. And we couldn't come up with only one single title, so we did it a la Lena Wertmüller, who often had 2 titles for her films, so they all have 2 titles. Okay. I taught at MICA for 1 semester, and I spent the whole time talking about the importance of observation to the students. And of course, I had sort of gone afield. I was observing, but I hadn't done a painting only from observation in years. So when I went home, I painted a painting only from observation. This doll was stuffed into a shelf. I actually didn't think I would ever paint it because it wasn't my kind of thing, actually. But and it was really a fascinating experience to do that. It looks better on the small screen. After that last New York show, which somehow didn't go as well as I had hoped, I got home and I was very angry about some things that had happened. So I made a drawing of this figure, and she was pretty angry. And so then I started a painting from the drawing, which I almost never do. But in the months it took to paint the painting, all the anger dissipated from the figure, so you don't see any of that. Okay. So you can see I repeat objects. They're things. Everything I have in the studio has some sort of meaning to me, although it's a completely undefined meaning. It's just something I respond to. Okay. I don't know what does this one have a progression? I can't remember which one I have. Yeah, that one has a progression. So you can see how I start and how I move through. And one of the things I really wanted to be in this painting was this figure, because I had never painted it. At this point, I'd started trying to paint some of the things that I had that had never managed to walk into a painting. And then ultimately, it came out. You know, she wiggled, she moved, the table changed, things shifted around. But that one thing that was the thing I actually wanted disappeared. This painting went through at least 4 different finished states in which it was shown, reproduced, etc., and kept getting reworked. It's not a very big painting. Okay. Now, I put this one in because I thought I'd give you a little strange little anecdote that's a bit peculiar. I've never said this anyplace. A lot of times people ask you about what made you choose art. Why are you an artist? Why are you a painter? And most of us, I don't think, have a real answer. I mean, Alan basically grew up that way. You know, he grew up in the world of art, but I did not. And my answer is associated a little bit with Providence, in that when I was 10 months old, my father who was a pilot, had his squadron out, and he had a bad landing on a carrier and went to the bottom of the ocean. So I never had that father. But I grew up from when my mother finally told me about him when I was 10. There was a mythology about him. He was a painter. He loved art. He loved painting and he loved opera. So the mythology that took over in my life at that point, I think, had a huge influence on who I became. I never knew him. I never saw much what he made, but there was this sense that there was this other person I could be. And that started in Providence. So I thought that was an interesting thing to speak of. And the reason that I speak about it here is I was working on these 2 small panels. They had started out as sketches of studies of my sons. These are my 2 sons. And I'd set them aside. It was for another painting that I was working on. And I had also, I move things from where I'm working off onto the side sometimes, and, you don't think about where you're putting them. And I was sitting back looking at another painting, and I saw this toy airplane and these 2 doll legs on the table. And for some reason, it made me think of my father and death, me and the airplane, because he went down in a plane. So I added a 3rd panel to this, which is not me, but symbolic of me. That's not usually in my work. Okay. All right, this is another example of this painting was finished for a long time, and I remember my older son, when he was visiting one time, looking at this, and he says, "Mom, are you really going to be able to leave that wall without anything on it? Really, Mom?" And I said, "Yes, that's what the painting's about. It's that space." Well, that's what the painting eventually became. Some years later, it was in the racks for years, and then I took it back out, and it became that. And I will say that I loved painting that painting. I don't love the actual painting of them all, but that one somehow had some sort of strange joy in it. Okay. This is a diptych. Again, and the color's off because this is the same color, but the color's off in the slides. Because of where we live, and because when we think about bringing paintings home, we have to confine them to a certain size to be able to roll them up and get them home. And I wanted to paint one bigger, and the only way I could do that was to paint a diptych. So I started it, and then at a certain point, I decided to make it reversible. Next one. That was a lot of fun to try. And I've never known which way. I sort of take votes when people visit as to which way they like it better. Sorry, Alan? Okay. Okay. This is another painting that was another painting before. And the only part of it that remains from the earlier painting are the doll parts that in the original painting were on the floor, laying on the floor. I was painting a painting that I was so frustrated with the figure in the painting, which I don't think I brought with me, that I was about to take the figure out entirely, and I decided, pazienza, Lani, just paint another painting with the doll parts and take a break. And then I never took the painting out because it was so bizarre. It was nice, I liked it, but so I turned it on its side and painted this. Okay. So we're now getting close to the end because these are more recent paintings. And this one's in the show. That's one of the, this is the second to last. This was before the one that I showed you as the last. And is there anything at the end? Did he? Oh, these are the stages of that. So it started out as a single figure, then two, then moved one over and saw the shadow of the second one, decided to make it to three, and the changes. And one of the things that's interesting when I look at these progressions is sometimes I wonder, why did you change what you changed? Because sometimes I think maybe they were better in an earlier stage. But anyway, we do what we do. Okay. I also work in collage, so these are some of my collages. Collage I work a little differently than in the paintings because I tend to work on them at night. I just put them across our big dining room table and I start them and then I make adjustments and they stay there for a long time. Basically, they stay there until I have to move them. And a couple of years ago, I decided to start making boxes because I have so many objects that I don't use. And I thought I might try to use them, make them become something else. It was very interesting, but it also challenging because I had to figure out how to attach things. So I ended up deciding to do them much the way I've made necklaces for many years, sewing them with rope or with wire. But okay. And sometimes when we're talking to students, they want to know, well, how was life? And this is just to show you that our kids, and Mark and Katya, you're going to remember all this. This is very, very familiar. This is them in our studio. This is how we lived. They were in the studio 100% of the time with us. They just lived there. We had a wood stove, and they'd even ride the trike around the wood stove. And they'd paint, and they'd sculpt, and etc. And I end with this because a lot of people often ask me about light in my paintings. Alan is more concerned with light that sort of works with way light might be. I'm in love with the inner light that comes from inside of a Van der Waal.
That's it. Okay.